And then at that point, once that point has been achieved, once that moment of typification or the crystallizing of a new type has arrived, Corbusier said, which is, let's say, the act of engineering and tinkering and so on, once it has been crystallized, then the architect's task emerges as one of clarification, heightening, perfection, beautification. So you can see here that he's kind of he's making these comparisons between the Greek temples, and there's various variants, and the car, and he says also the car has been already at the Corbusier's time in the early 20s. For him, has already reached that moment of the typical, and is now inviting the task of refinement, which was achieved in Greek architecture. Now, but I want to come, there's something also different going on, which is not so clear with the early works of Le Corbusier, which becomes very radically posed with the Gropius work and the Bauhaus, which is that the building itself becomes a kind of open-ended system. It's no longer organism-like, because we're rejecting symmetry and proportion in modernism. So the primary ordering principles of all architecture until then are denied. And that's quite radical. So what you have here is this asymmetry and the potential to stretch to any proportion. You can also make towers as high as you like, you can make band windows as long as you want, and you have the number of these elements is open-ended. You can add here or here. There's a typical institutional buildings. This is a bit kind of add or subtract. There's no sense of completeness. There's only one principle, curiously, which comes in to give a kind of some degree of control over that. And that is, on the one hand, you stay usually within the orthogonal, and these things are meant to be dynamic equilibrium compositions. That means there's some kind of sense of balance around a point, or even though this is different from that, they're kind of balanced. So you need to imagine that it gives a lot of degrees of freedom, but you wouldn't have a kind of very lopsided huge lump here and then small things there. So there wants to be, I think of it like as if you could construct mobiles. You can hang these on a point and they need to balance. Then you have a good composition in terms of modern architecture. And as we talked about that, it's dynamic equilibrium. Now dynamic equilibrium is dynamic because you can add a little bit here, anything you like, as long as you don't have to mirror symmetrically, but you have to kind of balance with something else. Right? So you can make a tall tower here, I might put another long horizontal bar there, etc. So there's some constraint on ultimate arbitrarity of this, but I think it is much more assemblage-like, obviously, because it's not complete, never complete. Zaha calls these also open compositions. And that's typical. And you can also see that there is this idea of regularity and uniformity is given up. You have the window formations in each of these volumes has different depths, different, to some extent even different floor to floor, different window formations. You know, that curtain wall, and here the punch window with the balconies, here a band window. So that's also possible. You can kind of aggregate different things. On the other hand, there was also, this idea of adding different geometries that went to the minutest detail. And this is, by the way, Gropius also designed the car at the time, which was an organism, but the building wasn't an organism. Now, this continues. All of modernism is based on this principle of drawing together parts which remain quite separate and could be quite different from each other, as long as they're in some kind of dynamic equilibrium. This is a late project by Le Corbusier. So you have curved and straight parts, flat parts, slabs, even these organic parts come in. And that's a kind of version of that. And I think and this is a very typical modernist composition. It's open-ended in a sense, so it's assemblage-like. It doesn't become an organism. These institutional buildings don't. But they have this principle of separateness of part and separateness and clarity of purpose. You can see it on the I don't know what the purpose is, but a certain purpose and certain depths certain furniture configuration, it's repetitive inside, is then cut off to remain very distinct from another part which is a different depth, different furniture, which is equally repetitive, and this is repetitive. So all these things are different from each other, but internally repetitive and clearly remain separate. And that is still organ-like. It's organ-like in the sense that each of them has a clear purpose. You know where the part begins, where it stops, and there's only a certain position and role. But what is no longer, so it's something in between an organism and an assemblage. The open-endedness and incompleteness is assemblage-like, but the rigidity of functional designation in these buildings, for instance in the Bauhaus, I know it, this is the student hostel or sleeping rooms, this is administration and classrooms, this is workshop. So there's an unmistakable allocation of distinct functions, like you would with an organism. Arms for, legs for walking, mouths for eating, etc. Okay, and here this is an very early work of started architects, so we have these different departments, but they kind of cluster and fuse, so the element lose their identity and they fuse and merge into some kind of central void, for instance. And this one pulls away, so there's on the one hand pulling away, there's tenuous connection, there's fusion, so there's a more deterritorialized idea. There are still elements and parts, but the relationship is not, their individual identity is getting obscured, let's say. And maybe this is too much. This is what you were talking about, the Parc de la Villette project. What is so radical about this? What is violates this idea of an organism with clearly delineated parts and functions is this strange idea of interpenetration of subsystems. Rather than being next to each other, they cut through each other. Rather than being complete, they're just hinted at and remain open. So this circular space is kind of indicated by these fragments, but it's good enough, you can still see it. Triangular space, there's a square, so there's square, circle and triangle, but they're kind of broken up. And then there is this kind of point grid, which is totally indifferent, it's just superimposed. A modernist would have done the circle, the triangle, the square as complete. Then they would have a point grid next to this, and maybe the squiggly line around it or next to it, and not everything kind of superimposed. So there's a very kind of radical condition, which means in the sense that in terms of, if I put my cursor here, I don't have a clear position in the system, because I'm maybe in the center of the triangle, but I'm also at this point I can choose where I locate myself, relative to the squiggly line or to the circle, to the triangle. Or if that wasn't exploded away, I could also be at the same time at this folly. So I have three descriptions competing at that point of where I am and which territory I'm in. So that's very unclassical and even unmodern in this sense, to the extent that the modern was still classical in terms of designating clear zones with clear functions. But this kind of superimposition of territorial identities, if you like, and the making ambiguous of territorial identity aligns with the more contemporary society, where you have different audiences and different populations using the same territory, but for different purposes. Then you need to have multifunctional, perhaps, spatial arrangements. This isn't just an example in an overall territory. There are two types of population: indigenous population, which lives locally and only uses local centers, never go to this city, and only go from their point directly to the closest center. That's the way they relate in the territory, and this is a kind of professional middle class population. They ignore these centers and only orient this way. So there's two populations with two social orders in the same territory. And I use that, and sometimes you can imagine that in such a thing you have different audiences doing different things in the same place. One is maybe just a couple moving along that winding path or visiting a folly. Another is a group playing football in this field or something and ignoring folly and this land and only looking at an overall territory, or a kind of demonstration or grouping around this center. There's many different things you could pick as reference system to do different things, and there's something there for these different things to pick on and to order your activity. Whereas in a modernist, there's always one place for one activity, and when you're there, there's only one order, one reference, and one purpose. And here you have multi-reference system, and therefore with multiple purposes. And it's much more assemblage, like you don't know how these things might, in some scenarios, interact. Okay, and this is in a sense, this picture where I move on slowly to, or maybe I'll come back to it later, how these things function together requires observers to recognize them as belonging and functioning together, to become actual functional, because it's the users or the observers who want to use and turn these ensembles into functions. They need to recognize that they belong together and then make use of them as an ensemble. And to some extent, this is what I always talked about, which pieces aggregate into what units of interaction, into what kind of functional entity. So the guitar, in one reading, and now we have different readings, there's an assemblage where, for instance, and that's just of course in a pictorial space, where this kind of shape here is the body of a guitar, and this is the whole of the guitar, and this is the kind of tensioning devices of the strings of the guitar. But in another reading, that disintegrates, and this is not this whole of the guitar, but the top plate on a pile of plates. And this body of the guitar is another armchair pushed against the table. So the guitar in these tensioning devices turn out to be other things. This is actually the top of a bottle, etc. So the guitar disappears, it's no longer there, because the guitar is just a construct of elements drawn together into a functional unit. If these elements in a different story are drawn apart into different functional scenarios, the guitar, even though nothing is moved, it's just they're looked at as being ready for another scenario, the guitar disappears, because the guitar is not. And that is very much architecture-like, because in architecture it's not about the contiguous physical integrity of an entity that makes it a unit of interaction, because everything in architecture is physically contiguous with everything else. So everything touches everything else anyway, particularly in a dense city where buildings touch each other, and they're all anyway rigidly connected through the ground, so everything is baked together. So we don't have the easy thing, this is something separate. So it's only what is the element, there's nothing moves against the background. So the question of what is something worthy of a unifying name is purely which pieces act together for particular social purposes, and only if these social purposes draw these things together, then this is a certain space, a certain building, a certain institution. Because a certain city, and you need to, obviously, also as an observer, you want to recognize which of the parts are meant to be together for what purposes. So that is then a kind of condition, but the interesting condition is, it could still be an organism in a complex city, but it's just difficult to recognize. But more interestingly, it could be an assemblage. For me, that is, it could be pieces pieces could be, in certain scenarios, drawn together by some people in this way, and then the pieces, they're not rigidly and fixed forever in these constellations. Even if nothing moves, another group is re-associating other pieces to a new constellation for its uses, and then this is very assemblage-like, because then these things, the purposes and designations and roles of the elements and what they belong to, and what is a part and what is a subgroup, it sort of all becomes fluid and deterritorialized. And that's, for me, is a perfect symbol, therefore, of a kind of assemblage condition. Okay. And this is obviously still some kind of, by now, an organism, because we know this armchair with ottoman and so on, and it has various different parts. It has, which is interesting to me, it has the leather, the wooden shell, the metal. Each material and form has a certain role in an overall integrated function. So this is interesting, this kind of multi-system complex, but fused in this case to something very, very well known and an organism. It's getting a bit kind of gross, I'm sorry. Just picked up some images, I thought, but you know, in assemblage. In this case, this hand has been grafted there, and who knows what capacities will evolve and what uses will be made of this. And I mean, the hand you can stretch your own foot easier. In fact, it's only temporary in this case, graft to maintain the hand alive while they're reconstituting the arm when it's later on refitted. But that would be obviously assemblage style, or artwork sometimes like this. I think this is two people plastered over. These are just symbols or images of what, you know, how you can think of an assemblage, or some gross kind of film by Chris Cunningham and an artist. And cyborgs and things like that. These are all the world of assemblages, if you like, or something like this. Which is quite cute. I don't know what you know, but if this is kind of, it is more an assemblage if you take the strap away and then there's another life and purpose of these elements, and then they come together again. So that the fluidity of reutilization is typical for what I would call an assemblage. So and then in the next round you strap in new pieces, etc., and you strap it again, but there's another piece missing. That's all the world of assemblages. There's kind of, you gain and lose pieces and parts continuously as the functionality and the purposes evolve, and also the role of the pieces in the purpose is multiple and evolving. Okay. Now it's, well, I stopped for 1 second. Anybody, is a distinction between assemblage and organism becoming clear as a question?
So could I consider mutation as assemblage?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm getting to that. It's mutations are first initially disrupting the organism. So it kind of damages the organism, corrupts the organism. It's not reproducing the organism, right? But then what happens? There's a moment of deterritorialization, fluidity. What is that mutation ending up? Most of the mutations are kind of eliminated. Mm-hmm. There are aberrations there which don't find a purpose.
Yeah.
But potentially, mutation, that's this kind of moment of deteriorization, could find a purpose. And then it's at that point it's kind of deteriorized, it's assemblage-like. But then it might, when this mutation is reproduced, survives and eliminates. If it was in a superior mutation, then it evolves into the new perfect state of the organism, and should a later offspring kind of revert back to the original without mutation, would then become the aberration.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very good point. And I'm coming to this in the sense that when I said the organism is that very stable constellation of, it's a single of where each part has a definite place and purpose as a contribution to an overall purpose. That this becomes problematic once I look at the evolution and the long view, a very long view. A short-term view or medium-term view in biology, that's hundreds of years. Well, depends on if you have fruit flies, you have quicker evolution. But let's say if you have mammals remain stable over thousands of years, obviously. So and then, but if you look at millions of years, you get into fluidity and deteriorization and you go to different games. So even the organism in the very long view is not as stable as we presumed so far. So we can talk about that as well to become clear, because we also have this kind of evolution much faster in the design world. As I said, the car emerged of a strange assemblage and then frozen into. And these kind of things happen now all the time as well in the artifact and design world. So it's useful to look at biology as a domain of transference to pick up a number of concepts and distinctions and a set of terms and vocabularies we could apply for design, because the biological evolution has been studied by biologists who are very smart and resourceful theorists and researchers, and so we can transfer that intelligence into the design discourse from there. So that's what we're doing. And one of the major concept here is this idea of the distinction again of what has been called exaptation as distinct from adaptation. Adaptation is a very well-known concept, which everybody should be very familiar with. That there's a certain purpose which has been established, and now there's kind of evolving an adaptation which is ever more perfectly fulfilling that function. You adapt to the conditions of life. For instance, the eye has evolved and adapted to the requirement of sharper resolution and distance viewing and so on, and three-dimensional viewing with the two eyes collaborating. There's a kind of whole trajectory where the human eye has ever more adapted to the requirements of human existence. But what is exaptation? Exaptation is so-called pre-adaptive advances where something, some properties of an organism evolve for one purpose, but then turn out to be a good idea for another purpose. Or they were just side effects or unutilized structures and shapes, which were just side effects for some other evolutionary trajectory. Certain features turn out to be good for a new condition which the organism faces, and that is then a kind of lucky, serendipitous pre-adaptation. It wasn't selected for that, but turns out to be good for that. For instance, the hand turned out to be good for writing, and writing was not on the cards. And so it's in everything in a complex evolved mammal organism turns out to have evolved initially for other purposes, and then switched purposes, and then once these new purposes are established, then there's again adaptation. And for instance, hands were originally feet, and then there was a transition where apes kind of were not only walking on the ground but also on the trees, so they created kind of, actually both the feet and the hands were similar kind of gripping feet. And then to some extent when humans learned the upright walk, only used there was not only tetrapods. Tetrapods are these kind of four-limbed locomotion creatures, which are not only mammals but reptiles. So we are the first kind of nearly, well, there's kangaroos as well, but they don't do much with there. They have kind of rudiments. They do little bits, but not enormous amounts. So, but for us it was great to have that kind of lose the function of the four legs and set them free for new purposes, which were kind of monumental potentials for human beings. So they were, feet became hands, and hands is not something which exists in the animal world so much. But everything we have was evolved for another purpose. So the mouth, which is tongue, teeth, breathing, all of this, very good for speaking. I mean, very kind of supple lips and so on. But of course, they originally is an eating organ, and eating and chewing and swallowing, all of that acquired a new this apparatus. But I think the once we started to speak, I mean, it also evolved a little bit, in the direction of that. But it's a kind of ancillary, secondary, and so to some extent, the kind of speaking capacity of the mouth was some kind of exaltation, which turned out to be useful. So. And,
excuse me,
yeah.
Can I have some question from last part still?
Yeah.
There was one question for me because you put 3 examples, it was quite from modern art. Like you put example of Picasso.
Mm-hmm.
Can you?
Yeah.
Yeah, you put example of Picasso at the beginning, and then you put this example of Bernard Schoenberg, and then you put our example with this Look, kind of assembly examples that you brought. The first example that you put, it was kind of, I don't know, a human with 3 heads or 2 legs that you couldn't distinguish of a man or woman or the lizard. And the situation was happening there was actually, you couldn't guess how many, for instance, sexual activity we had, because we assume that, okay, sexual activity, they don't need sexual organs, they need certain, kind of occasion that the bodies are together. This means my main question is about difference between assembly and organization, the intelligence behind that. It's okay, in these cases, the artist kind of designed the intelligence behind this, and kind of guess what's going to happen. But what I'm telling about is is it different between the intention of these two subjects, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you just look at the painting, it's just a hint. We don't have a really functioning assemblage, right? We just have an image of what could be imagined to be assemblage. Certain properties of a real assemblage would be a guerrilla army, which keeps switching leadership, where everybody keeps switching their role, where somebody is leaving and somebody new is coming. That's the kind of assemblage. Whereas the regular army is the organism, right? And the house, which is a proper family house where everything has its place and a place for everything required, if that turns into kind of a commune for students with coming and going, giving and taking, where some parts are suddenly separated off, you don't know what is the unit, the proper unit, what belongs to the house anymore. There is something that now had broken through the walls, quarters into the next house. So that's assemblage, and the whole thing is very fluid, and they keep changing. Where's the kitchen? Where's the dining room? Or they keep kind of reutilizing, reassociating, and that's the kind of assemblage in the extreme in terms of, let's say, the house. Now the painting, I can imagine, it's a bit like group sex, right? And where there's a lot of fluidity. A lot of people are bisexual. They're unexpected stimulation with unexpected parts of the body. That's where it comes from in terms of Deleuze and Guattari, the body without organ. That is the kind of scenario. But you should generalize it into. Later we talk about in biology. I have some images, things like symbiotic relationships between their organisms. That's kind of assemblage-like, but they stabilize into kind of quasi-organism to some extent as well. But it's more assemblage-like because, So the intelligence is usually mostly like an organism itself. Even human institutions which are organism-like, they're usually not invented and designed so much. They're evolved. And now we have, of course, we have kind of designers now designing houses, and we need to recognize with this fluidity of society, and we have maybe fluid client, so we need to start designing assemblages. I mean, originally none of these were designed, and then, but now we have to design everything, both organisms and assemblages. And yet the design is never final and finite, and we can no longer so strictly predict how it's going to be utilized, but we should speculate about it. And I like to design buildings which have that sense of multivalency with respect to affiliations with context, so blurring the building into context, so its unity as a new project could be, in some readings, be denied, because it might have to just function as part of, a retail element must be functional of the line of retail which spins out of our site, for instance, so that shouldn't be contained within the project. Other parts remain more autonomous, so on. So that's what I would say. The intelligence is in the end an evolving outcome of a let's say a social process. But as designers, we can anticipate that, speculate about it. We hear about it from the client who has certain ideas about it. But this painting itself is obviously not the real assemblage. And to some extent, when we design something and explain it as an assemblage, whether it really will be an assemblage, it's so to some extent we have to distinguish the drawings on our drawing board or models, which are kind of simulations and speculations, and real functioning buildings or places, territories. This is what we, in the end, we should only call these things organisms or assemblages. And the drawings and pictures and paintings are just hints towards or designs towards. So because the assemblage is something that's ultimately something which is really, it's functioning. It is living, it is a life process. And it's not an inert thing. I mean, that's the final criteria. Now, any other question? Yeah?
Well, let's say it's much easier to understand about organism, also as example, like rather in architecture and as a family and as a physical organism. But with assemblage, it's a little bit more tricky, especially when it comes to multifunctionality in architecture. Because let's say, especially in the urban environment, we have lots of objects. Let's say, even like big malls, we have the same time car shops, food shops, sometimes almost like the places for children to work in, almost kindergartens or the whole time. Yeah. So, and actually sometimes entertaining centers which doesn't have to do anything with the shops. At the same time, they do have something to do with each other. And like the question, I'm very interested in kind of this like blurred border between organism and assemblage which actually takes place in architecture, because I'm sure it's not just black and white, it's rather gray zones. Yeah. Like could you give me more examples where, let's say, we have that kind of merge between organism and assemblage, like that architectural example?
Well, it's true. A lot of places in contemporary cities are this kind of in between, or on the way from one to the other, potentially.